Hey everybody, and welcome to Train Signal. Now that we've got all that planning out of the way, it's time to get busy with an install. Don't get me wrong, the planning is vital to a successful install of SQL Server. It's just not very fun, right? So we're going to start with the pre-install tasks. There's really only one, and that's installing the .NET Framework. I'm going to show you two different ways to do it though, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, here we are inside a Windows VM. I've installed Windows 2008 R2 with SP1 and joined it to a domain. That's the only thing I've done to this box. So the first thing we have to do is install the .NET Framework. The easiest way to do that, I say the easiest, what I mean is the most common way to do that, is to go down here to Server Manager. Now that we have Server Manager, go to Features and say Add Features. You're going to choose the .NET Framework. Just tell it OK. Tell it next, next, next. Next you're going to click install, but I'm not going to because I want to go and show you the other way. But that's really all there is to it, is just next, 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 next. I'm going to cancel out of that. Close the Server Manager. Okay, now I'm going to show you the command line way. And by command line, I mean PowerShell. There are two ways to do this one as well. So I'm going to go to Start, Admin Tools, and Windows PowerShell modules. Tell it OK. Now you can see it loading the different modules here, PS Diagnostics and Server Manager and all that, right? Okay, so first let's go ahead and do what we did before. Let's check to see if the feature is installed to begin with. So we're going to say get Windows feature. And it'll instantly give us back a list of features. Let's come back up to the top. Now I'll explain what we're looking at. Here you can see under Application Server, you can see .NET Framework 3.5.1. That's what we're looking for. And it doesn't have a check by it. Where is it? Sorry, there we go. It doesn't have a check by it. But down here, File Services does. So File Services is installed while the .NET Framework isn't. You notice also that we have a display name and a name. What you want to install is the name itself. So instead of installing the .NET Framework 3.1, you want to install ASNet Framework. So instead of doing that, I'm going to show you the other way to do it. I'm going to close that. Now, and remember the first time we just went to Start, Admin Tools, and then Windows PowerShell modules. This time we're just going to go straight to PowerShell. Now, if I say get Windows features here, it tells me that it's not recognized as a command line. That's because I haven't installed any of the Windows PowerShell modules, right? You only need one for this though, and that's the Server Manager. So if you just do import module, Server Manager comes back instantly. Use my up arrow to say get Windows feature. And now I can get my Windows features. And again, you can see that under Application Server, the .NET Framework still isn't installed. So I'll come back down here to the bottom, and I'll say Add Windows feature. And now I'll say ASNet Framework. But watch what happens when I do this. See? Security restrictions imposed by user account control. Now remember, the first time, let me close this down. The first time when I went to Windows PowerShell modules, I got this warning, right? This user account control warning, and I had to say yes. But the second time I didn't. See, this time I didn't. That's because the Windows PowerShell modules opens up as admin. So what we have to do here is right click and say run as administrator. Now we get the UAC. There we go. Now I still have to import again. Now I can say add Windows feature. And it's installing. So of course, while that's installing, let's go ahead and talk about something. I did that on purpose so that you could see that there are two different ways to do this. If you install all of the Windows modules, it can take a little bit longer. and they're not all needed. And you saw how fast the server manager installed through PowerShell. And I also showed you how you have to run PowerShell under as an administrator in order to do this. So I wanted to show you both of those because you're going to run into them. And it finished. Perfect timing. So success is true. It doesn't require a restart. Let's go ahead and say get Windows feature again, just to show ourselves that it installed. There we go. Let's scroll back up to the top again. And you can see here under Application Server, the .NET Framework is installed. So now we're golden. Okay, now we're going to do our first install of SQL Server, and we're going to do it from the GUI, or the wizard. Now, the reason we're going to do it from the GUI is because you can see all of the screens that it's going through, you can see all the selections that you need to make. It's the best place to learn from. You get to learn about all the features, you get to learn the general rules of setup and the types of things it's looking for and the stuff that you have to configure. You can install SQL from the GUI for the rest of your life if you want. You're just not going to want to. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. All right, we're back in our VM. I'm going to say Start, Computer, and here I've got the DVD loaded. If you're using a network install, then just go to that location. I'm going to right-click and say Open. On Setup, I'm going to right-click and say Run as Administrator. Yes. Now, depending on your box, whether you're going across the network or the speed of your box or the speed of your DVD player, right? It can take, I don't know, up to 40 seconds or so for this to come up. And in which case it's gonna, during that time, it's gonna flash on and off a few times. Don't worry about that. It'll eventually come up. Okay, and here we are on the SQL Server Installation Center. We're finished with all the planning. So we're gonna go jump straight to install. The choices you have here are new SQL Server standalone installation or add features to an existing install. We can install a cluster, we can add a node to a cluster, or we can upgrade from a previous version. Since this is our first install, we're clearly going to install a standalone version. And again, it's going to flicker on and off a couple times possibly and take a few seconds to come up, but don't worry, it'll come up. So this is the first screen that you come up with when you start the actual install, the setup support rules. It's going to run these rule checks 3 or 4 times during the install. So these are going to be the, I guess the sanity points, right? The sanity checkpoints. You notice here that 8 passed, 0 failed, 0 warnings, and 0 skipped. If I expand this to show the details, I can see everything that it was checking for. If you've got all greens, you're good to go. If you've got any yellows in here, those are just warnings and they'll be listed up here. And you're also good to go. A warning doesn't mean that it's something that'll fail the setup. A warning just means it's something that may make a specific feature work incorrectly or not work at all until you get that resolved. But you can't have any failures. If there are any reds anywhere in here, the OK button will be grayed out and you won't be able to continue with setup until you resolve whatever issue it is. Also, if there are any warnings or errors, this will be expanded by default. So when you get your setup support rules, when it finishes this, if you have to click Show Details, then that means everything is fine. Also, if you do have something that you get resolved, you don't have to go through all of the beginning steps of setup again. You can just resolve it outside of setup, come back and hit Rerun, and it'll rerun the checks and tell you if everything's okay. So we're going to go ahead and say OK. Okay, here we are. Product key. Accept the license terms. I suppose I may be legally bound to say make sure you read the license terms first. Send feature data to Microsoft. I get a lot of questions about this. People are just afraid that Microsoft is collecting private information about your company or about your server, your IP address, your server name, just whatever might be there. And that's just not the case. There is no identifying information sent to Microsoft at all. The only thing that is sent is literally feature usage about the hardware configuration and about the SQL Server components themselves. So Microsoft uses this data just to decide which features to enhance or maybe which features to dump because not enough people are using them. So I like to provide them with that kind of information. You can check it or not. Here it's going to check for product updates. There we are. Now it's finished installing the setup support files, and you can see it's run another set of support rule checks. And you notice that now it is expanded by default, and we have a warning on the Windows firewall. Don't worry, you always get that warning. I've never seen that warning not show up. It's not a showstopper. Let's go ahead and click Next. Setup role, we want SQL feature installation, absolutely. Now we're on to feature selection. This is the meat of the install. These are the actual features that you're going to install, and we're going to be here for a while. So before I start actually discussing different features, I want you to know that there are two different camps that DBAs fall into. The first camp is only install exactly what you need. Don't open up any extra holes or take up any extra resources. Only install what you need, and if you need something else, then you can install it later. I suppose that follows a certain line of paranoid thought. The other camp says install practically everything in case you need it, and then just disable the things that you don't need right away. And really, both sides have a point. The first camp is rooted in long-standing security paranoia. I'm not saying it isn't warranted, but it is a long-standing security paranoia. In my shop, I manage something like 700 SQL boxes, and we do upwards around 3 to 5 installs a week. We go through, ebbs and flows, right? But different features are always being requested from my team. I'm always having somebody say, oh, by the way, I need to run reporting services, or hey, I need to run SIS, or hey, I need replication turned on because now we're changing our DR strategy, or we've finally written a DR strategy and we want to use replication for that. And in an environment that big, in most companies anyway, you've got a lot of red tape involved in adding a feature. So right now, as we're installing, this box isn't in production, so I can do anything to this box I want. But once it goes into production, I have to have change controls, I have to have RFCs, I have to get people to sign off on it, I have to notify users of downtime, I have to have backup plans, I have to have all this stuff in place just to add replication, or just to add reporting services, or just to add integration services or something like that. And it's just not worth it most of the time when all I have to do is install all of that stuff at the beginning and then disable it as a post-install task when I'm done and be done with it. Because I'm telling you, it's much easier in a large environment, or sometimes even in a mid-size environment, to just go in and turn on a service than it is to install a brand new feature or a new set of features. Most companies, and I'm going to say this like I know most companies, but most companies I've seen don't require any kind of RFC or change control simply to turn on a service. So it's really much easier, and you're more responsive to your customers too, because if they want reporting or if they need replication, they don't have to wait a week for this process to happen. You can go in there and turn it on right away. So there's no reason, in my opinion, to not install most of the features. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and discuss the features. We've got the database engine services. Of course, that's the SQL database engine itself. That's what's responsible for actually storing data. SQL replication. This feature is what's going to allow you to keep a near real-time copy of your database on another server. SQL has other features that do this as well, but replication is definitely one of the oldest, and it's one of the more common. So I'll always go ahead and install it because it does no harm. There's nothing to turn off, nothing to turn on. It's just there or it's not. So there's no reason not to install it. And you never know when you're going to need replication turned on. Full text and semantic extractions for search. This allows you to not only search through very large quantities of text data, say if you've got varchar max data, but it also allows you to extract some semantic variances out of them and search for meaning. So you can look for words not only like will, but you can look for won't and will not and wouldn't. So you can look for variations, semantic variations of those words as well. It's actually pretty cool. Data quality services. Data quality is a really big issue in any database system. And what data quality services does is it allows you to, I hate to say ensure the quality of your data because that's tautological, but what that means is it allows you to scrub your data to ensure that everything is what it should be. So for example, let's say that you have a city field in an input form and that city is Dallas. Well, maybe somebody doesn't know how to spell Dallas, so they spell it D-A-L-I-S. Somebody else fat fingers it and spells it with 3 L's. Somebody else spells Dallas D-A-L-L-E-S. You've got all of these different spellings, all these different variations of the word Dallas, but they all mean the same thing. They all mean Dallas. So what DQS does is it allows you to go in there and make all of those different variations the same. And that's really important when it comes to reporting or simply querying too, right? So data quality services gives you that ability. Analysis services, this is Microsoft's main BI engine, and it's what allows you to write cubes that do roll-up type of operations as well as deep drill down. This is Microsoft's main BI product for data mining and whatnot. Now, this is one of the only exceptions, and I say one of the only exceptions to the install everything rule, because typically when you have an SAS box or an AS box or an install, you usually have its own server for it because analysis services is fairly resource intensive. It's very memory intensive. It's typically quite CPU intensive. And usually when you have a BI initiative like that, you install that on its own server and separate it from the database itself. So when I install analysis services, it's for an AS project, and it usually doesn't belong on an OLTP database. So this is one of the few exceptions to the install everything rule. But you can install it on here if you like. I'm just not going to. Reporting services. This is Microsoft's main reporting engine, and what this does is it allows you to take reports that you've written and put them up on a server so that users can get them. Users can connect to the server, they can subscribe to reports and get them delivered on a scheduled basis. You can, from the server itself, you can schedule reports and send them out to people. You don't have to, you can email them, you can drop them out on a file share. You can just generate the report and have it waiting there for people to come get it. You can generate it in a number of different formats like Word, Excel, PDF, and a few others. So there are lots of things you can do with reporting services. You can even have data-driven subscriptions if you're on Enterprise, where you can define which users get which reports based off of data parameters that you set up in the subscription. So it's a pretty rich feature. It's got security wrapped around it. It's got a number of features that you'll really like. So if you need to do any reporting, go ahead and use reporting services because it's free. Now we also have reporting services SharePoint and the SharePoint add-ons. If you want to do reporting like I just talked about, you have to use the native. You cannot use SharePoint. The only thing that reporting services SharePoint is for is to use reporting services as a SharePoint backend, so to speak. So unless you're specifically using SharePoint, do not install this. Data quality client. This is the client that goes with the data quality services. So whenever you want to create one of those data rules, so let's go back to Dallas, right? Let's say that you want to create a Dallas rule that puts all of the horrible misspellings of Dallas into one pristine spelling. This is where you'll actually set that up. SQL Server data tools. The data tools in previous versions of SQL, if you have any experience with the previous versions, used to be called BIDs. Now it's called data tools. And what this is the Visual Studio shell component of SQL Server. And it's what allows you to not only write reporting services reports, it also allows you to write analysis services. It also allows you to write integration services packages, and we're clearly going to talk about that in a minute. But the data server tools are what make all of that possible. I like to install those on every single box because they're usually version specific. If I'm in SQL 2005, then I have to use the 2005 version of BIDS because that's the version of the .NET framework that it's tied to. If I'm in SQL 08, then I have to use the version of the tools that came with it if I want to write SRS reports or if I want to write any ETL packages, because I'm not going to be able to deploy it to the server unless I author the package or the report with that version of the tools. And of course, I also have 2012 to contend with now. So in my shop, I've got a huge mixed shop, and I've got all flavors of SQL. I've got all the way down from 2000 all the way to 2012, and I don't have every one of those tools loaded on my laptop. You can't. So I like to put a copy on every server, and if I need to write a package or if I need to write a report, then I'll TS into that server itself, and I'll write the report directly from the console there. So it's a really good idea to have the tools on every server. Of course, you don't have to if you don't want to. That's just my reasoning as to why I do it. Client tools connectivity. This clearly just installs all of the network libraries and everything you need to actually connect to SQL Server. Integration services. This is the ETL tool we were just talking about. So ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. And what that means is taking data from one server and putting it on another server. Or in this, I'll say one database to another database, because that database could be on the same server. But if you need to, say, copy one table from one server to another, but you need the columns to look different, or maybe you don't need all the columns, or maybe you need to change the format of the dates, or you need to transform the data in some other way via maybe a data quality services project, right? Then this is what you would use for that. Integration services has become a very rich ETL tool, and you can take data from multiple disparate sources and push them out to as many disparate targets as you need to, including flat files and XML files and Excel files and tables, and you can do anything you want. Client tools backward compatibility. Of course, that's what allows you to connect to previous versions of SQL. Client Tools SDK. SDK stands for Software Development Kit. I always say if you need to know whether or not you need to install that, then you don't need to install it, because you're either a software developer or you're not. I've never had to install this. Documentation components are a good idea. I like having documentation on every server I install. The main reason for that, again, is the same reason as I put all of the data tools on there. I can't keep every version of the documentation on my local laptop. So if I need a version-specific set of documentation, I can go to the server for it if I need to. Management tools. This is going to be the main way that you interact with your database, is through Management Studio is what we call it. And there's a basic and a complete version. Now the basic just gives you these following basic tools over here: the distributed replay, the SQL command and PowerShell, Management Studio, right? But if you notice over here, the complete, that's what gives you your support for reporting services and AS and IS, Profiler, Database Tuning Advisor, Server Utility Management, all of that kind of stuff. I always install the complete tools. Distributed Replay Controller. This is brand new to SQL Server 2012. And what it does is it allows you to capture a workload through Profiler. So what you can do is if you have an application that runs against a database, you can turn on SQL Profiler and capture everything it's doing. And then you can save that to a file. And the distributed replay controller, what it does is it allows you to replay that workload on any number of boxes you need to. So let's say you wanted to test different hardware configurations or different database configurations, different versions of the database even. You could do that through the distributed replay controller, and it would allow you to replay that workload on all those different boxes with all the different scenarios. Then you can benchmark it, look at the numbers, and decide what the best course of action to take is. Distributed replay client, it's what's actually, it's going to connect to the controller, and it's what's going to actually generate the workload. Again, we have the SQL Client Connectivity SDK. SDK, again, is Software Development Kit. You usually don't need that. And Master Data Services. Master Data Services is kind of like Data Quality Services, except Master Data Services is concerned with making sure that the data goes into SQL correctly. But it goes much deeper than that. It gives you a global enterprise way to have sort of a live data dictionary. So as data comes in, you can make sure that it looks the way it should look, but you can also set up complex business rules, workflows, and all of that to make sure that the data is doing what it's supposed to be doing. There's a lot of things that you can do with MDS. If you have an environment where you tend to have data troubles, it's worth looking into. Okay, now that we're finished with the feature selection, we're going to move into the installation rules, and that's right, it's going to run another rules check. See, it's already back. I had 2 passed, 0 failed. You can see what it's looking for here. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay, instances. An instance of SQL is just what we're doing now. We're installing an instance of SQL. The first time you install SQL on a server, you're going to install the default instance. You don't have to. You can install a named instance, but usually we tend to install a default instance. Now, an instance can be hard to understand, but think of it like a VM, right? You can install VMware on a server, and you can put multiple VMs on that server. Each one of those VMs is completely separate. It's a completely separate install of Windows. It's a completely separate install of Windows 2008 or XP or Windows 7 or even Linux, right? And none of those servers even know the other servers exist. They communicate with each other across the network. They have completely separate security. As far as those VMs are concerned, they're completely separate entities, and they have no idea that they're on the same box. The same holds true for websites. When you have different websites under IIS, you have website 1, website 2, website 3. All of those guys have completely separate security. They have completely separate website files. They have completely separate directories. Absolutely everything on there is separate, and they don't even have any idea that the other websites on that server even exist. And if they do communicate with each other, they usually communicate with each other over the wire across HTTP, like every other website does, right? So think of instances just like that. 2 instances of SQL are 2 completely separate installs of SQL on the same box. So the default instance gets the 1 path, the first named instance gets a second path, the third named instance gets a different path, and it actually lays down the full install bits for every single version. So if one instance of SQL communicates with a different instance of SQL on that same box, it communicates with it over the wire the same way it does with any other instance. So connecting to one instance versus another instance on the same server, as far as SQL is concerned, that second instance could be in Japan and the first instance could be in Australia. It has no idea. So these are 2 completely separate entities on here. I want to make that clear, because that's going to help you decide whether or not you need to install separate instances on a box. So the most common reason to install multiple instances on a box is simply to save hardware. Quite often you could have 2 completely separate production instances on a box, but also quite often you'll have a dev and a test and a QA instance on a server, because you don't have multiple servers, but you do have one fairly decent server, and putting all of these things in multiple instances so that you can ensure that one environment doesn't bring another environment down. So if you have a developer who writes a query that takes up all of the memory, if you had that in the same instance, it would take up all of the memory for that instance of SQL, and it would bring production down. But since every instance has its own set of memory, sure, it'll bring down the dev instance of SQL, but it won't affect the QA or the production instance of SQL that happen to be on that same box. So that's the most common reason that people install separate instances. There are also some cases where you have government regulations where you have very strict security guidelines and you absolutely have to have separate instances. Actually, what they say is they like to insist that it's on separate physical hardware, but they settle for separate instances because they know that the instances of SQL are completely separate from each other. So not sharing security is one reason, and another one is just to conserve hardware if you need to have multiple environments where there's no reason, where there's no way for them to interact with each other and bring each other down. So the default instance is always going to be named MS SQL Server. We'll click Next. disk space requirements. We'll click next. Nothing for us to do there. Server configuration. Now, you can assign a user account if you want, and either an AD account or a local server account. We're going to go ahead and leave the default. We've got the startup type here of manual for SQL agent. I like to switch that to automatic. I'll explain the services later. And SQL Server browser is disabled. We're going to leave it disabled. As far as collation goes, you're better off leaving it. If you don't know what collation is and you don't have a special requirement, you're better off leaving the default collation just as it is. Okay. Whether or not to use Windows authentication or SQL in Windows, which is what we call mixed mode. Windows authentication is easy. It's just, if you have an AD account, you can give that AD account permissions in SQL, and everything goes as according to plan. However, with SQL authentication, it has nothing to do with AD whatsoever. SQL Server keeps track of its logins itself, so you can put a login into SQL and use that solely as your sole authentication mechanism, much the same way that if you have an AD account, you can also have a local Windows account that has nothing to do with AD. This is kind of the same thing. You can have a SQL account that has nothing to do with AD or Windows whatsoever. And this is usually useful if you have a domain that isn't trusted and you can't authenticate an AD account. So you'll give somebody a SQL account and they can connect to your SQL box if you're going over the internet for some reason. Or more commonly, even in the same domain, if you've got Linux or Unix boxes that need to connect to your SQL box. So a good example of that would be, an Oracle server on Unix needing to connect through Informatica to get information off of your SQL box and put it in Oracle for data warehousing or something like that. So we're only going to use Windows authentication here. I'm going to add the current user as an admin. That's what it's asking you here. You can come here, you can add anybody you like, including Windows groups. Data directories. These are the default data directories. So the default user the default user database and user database log. If you write a create database statement and you don't specify the directories where you want the data and log files to go for those user databases, it's going to put them in here by default. I don't typically change this because I always create databases with explicit file locations, but you can if you want to. TempDB, this is where TempDB is going to be stored. I almost always change this one. We'll talk about when and why you would change database and file locations later on in the course. But for right now, I'm going to leave it here because I've only got a single VM with a single drive. And the backup directory, again, this is just the default. So if you back up your database and don't specify a file location to go with the file, then it'll back it up here by default. And again, these are only the defaults. So nothing is to keep you from backing up your database to any location you want. Nothing is to stop you from creating a database in any location you want. These are just the defaults in case you don't specify those locations. File stream, I like to turn that on. File stream allows you to store large files like Word docs and PDFs and whatnot on the file system, but allow them to still be backed up with the database. Now that's a really big deal for those of us who manage large file repositories in the database, because this way it allows you to ensure that the files that are on the file system and the metadata you have in your database are always consistent. Moving right along, reporting services, just tell it to install and configure. It's easiest. Distributed replay controller, I'm going to add myself as the admin. I'm going to give myself permissions. You can add anybody you like, but here you actually can't add a group. You have to add individual users. Distributed replay client, you have to give it the name of the controller. I like to say dist replay and then the machine name. That's just my personal naming convention. You can pick anything you like. And then these are the working directories. I always like to send errors to Microsoft. More configuration rules. This is the last one. You show details and see what it's looking for. Again, if there were anything red, you wouldn't be able to continue. Now it's ready to install. The configuration file path, I'm going to point out, we're not going to use it just yet. We're going to use it in the next lesson, but I just want to point out that the configuration file.ini is in a specific path and it's created for you. I'll discuss that more in the next lesson. But now, let's just click install. There we go. Now, depending on your hardware, and of course whether or not you're doing a network install, I've seen this take anywhere between 10 and 20 minutes to 45 minutes. There's just no telling how long this is going to take. So I'm going to pause and I'll come back when it's done. Okay, you can see the install is almost half done, and I thought I'd take this time to talk about some of the post-install tasks. Now officially, you don't have to do anything post-install. You can just fire up SQL Server and start creating databases and doing whatever you need. But logically, there are some things that you'll want to do in most environments, right? We already talked about turning off the services that you don't want, or I should say don't need right away. Other things you may want to do would be like installing backup routines, installing reindex routines or check DBs, stuff like that that just allow for the normal care and feeding of your database, because they don't manage themselves. No, I'm not going to teach you how to do all that right now. I'm just talking about post-install tasks, and as we come to those sections in later lessons, I'll go ahead and point those out as something that you may want to add as a post-install task. You know, there are several server configurations that you may want to change as well. And let's not forget security. Security is a big deal. One of the first things you're going to want to do is set up security. And of course, we'll talk about that in a later lesson as well. But I just wanted to take this time to talk about the post-install tasks that you need to keep in mind as you, not only as you plan your install, but as you go through the rest of the lessons. Okay, the install finished. I'm going to go ahead and click OK on that. And you can see here that we have all greens. Nothing failed. If anything did fail, you could come down here to the summary log file and it would tell you what failed. We're not going to go into that right now. So as far as install goes, we're finished. You can go ahead and I would say you can go ahead and complete the post-install task that we talked about during the install, but I haven't taught you how to do that yet. We'll talk more about the services and stuff in the next lesson. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next lesson.